Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1881, a gust of wind carried the scent of sagebrush and smoke over the plains. And by the time Georgia Alcott stepped off the overburdened stagecoach into the dust-blown town of Laramie, she had already made up her mind to leave again. Her boots hit the dirt with a thud. She pressed one hand to her ribs where the bruises had not quite healed and gathered her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The child beside her, no more than 6, clung to her skirt without saying a word. "Come on, Gentry," Georgia whispered, her voice steady but soft. "Just a few more steps." The boy coughed. His face was pale beneath the layer of dust, and his eyes, too old for his age, flicked around the street like he expected someone to drag them back. Georgia kept her chin high and her stride even. She had no family left, no money, and nowhere to go. But she had Gentry, and she'd kill or die before she let anyone take him again. She did not notice the cowboy watching from the stable across the street until their eyes met. He leaned against the fence post, arms folded, hat tilted just enough to shadow his face. He was tall, wide-shouldered, sun-tanned, and unmistakably alone, the kind of man who lived quiet and rode hard. A horse nickered behind him. He did not look away. Georgia didn't break stride. She crossed the street, guiding Gentry toward the sheriff's office, the last official place she planned to visit in this dusty town before figuring out where they would sleep. But the cowboy stepped off the fence rail and followed. She stopped, turned. "Can I help you?" The man tipped his hat. "Name's Xander Sutton. That your boy?" Her heart thudded. "He is now." He studied her, not unkindly. "You got people waiting here?" "No." "You got a place to stay?" "No." He nodded like he expected that. "Come with me." Georgia narrowed her eyes. "I do not know you." "I know." He glanced at Gentry, who was staring at him with wary eyes. "But I got a cabin on the edge of town. Empty bunk, stoveworks, no strings." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to trust a stranger. But the boy needed warmth, and she had nothing but a shawl, a few coins, and stubbornness. "I do not take charity," she said. "I do not offer it," Xander replied. "I got work needs doing, fence mending, garden planting. I will feed you both and keep a roof over your heads. That is all." He turned and walked away without looking back. Georgia stood frozen for a moment. Then she looked down at Gentry. "Do you want to try?" The boy nodded. They followed. The cabin was small and plain but clean. 2 rooms, one with a rough pine bed, the other with a straw mattress and a quilt folded at the foot. Xander handed her a tin plate of stew without speaking, then set a smaller one in front of Gentry. Georgia waited for the boy to eat first. When he picked up the spoon with shaking hands, she exhaled. "Thank you," she said, still standing. Xander just nodded and went back to fixing a cracked stirrup by the hearth. That night, Georgia lay on the straw mattress, staring at the wooden beams above her. Gentry slept beside her, curled against her side. The cabin was quiet except for the creak of old wood and the steady crackle of the fire. In the middle of the night, the boy whimpered in his sleep, limbs twitching. Georgia sat up and pulled off her shawl, tucking it around his thin body. He settled, breathing steady. She did not realize Xander had been watching from the doorway until he stepped back into the shadows. The next morning, he handed her a pair of work gloves without a word. Over the next few days, Georgia worked. She mended fence rails with nails and wire while Gentry followed her, sometimes helping, sometimes just watching. She chopped kindlings, swept the porch, and learned the rhythm of the land. Xander was quiet. He spoke when needed, never more, but he always poured her coffee before his own. He gave Gentry the last biscuit without saying a word. And when Georgia burned her hand on the stove, he dipped a cloth in cool water and wrapped it around her fingers with a gentleness that startled her. One afternoon, as a storm rolled over the plains, Gentry disappeared. Georgia's heart nearly stopped. She searched the cabin, the barn, the creek behind the property. She called his name until her throat turned raw. "He was scared," she told Xander, shaking. "He always runs when he is scared." Xander saddled his horse fast and without question. "He will not be alone out there." They found Gentry huddled beneath a wagon half a mile from the cabin, soaked to the bone and crying so softly Georgia barely heard him over the rain. She dropped to her knees in the mud and pulled him close, wrapping her shawl around his small body again. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here, baby." Xander stood nearby, rain dripping off his hat. Watching them, she looked up at him. "Thank you," he met her eyes. "You do not owe me anything." "I know," she said. "But I am still grateful." He nodded once, then reached down and lifted Gentry into his arms. Georgia followed, soaked and silent, heart pounding. That night, after the storm passed and Gentry was asleep, Georgia stepped onto the porch where Xander stood watching the stars return. "I should be moving on," she said. He turned. "Why? I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," she looked at him. "Why are you helping us?" Xander's jaw tightened. "Because I made a mistake once, a long time ago. I had a little sister. I left her behind when I joined a cattle drive. She died 2 winters later. I did not go back in time." Georgia's breath caught. "I look at that boy," he said, voice low, "and I think maybe this time I can do something right." She walked closer, standing beside him now. "You already have." For a long moment, they just stood there, the air cool and clear after the rain. Then she reached for his hand. He let her. He did not speak, but his fingers curled around hers like he had been waiting for that moment longer than he cared to admit. And for the first time in years, Georgia felt like maybe, just maybe, she had found somewhere she could stay, somewhere she could be safe, with someone who would not leave. By late May, the air had taken on the dry, pollen-sweet scent of blooming chokecherry and cottonwood. The wind came warmer now, and the soil had begun to soften beneath Georgia's boots. She knelt beside the small patch of earth behind the cabin, hands stained with loam, coaxing rows of beans and onions into place, one careful seed at a time, while Gentry gathered water from the creek in a dented tin pail too big for his thin arms. Xander had traded 2 horses for lumber in town the week before. Georgia had watched him unload the wagon plank by plank, his movements slow and thoughtful. He hadn't said what it was all for, and she hadn't asked. But this morning, she found him near the edge of the clearing, measuring the ground with a length of twine and marking it with river stones. She stood beside him, brushing a curl of hair from her cheek. "What are you building?" He didn't answer at first, just walked a few paces in silence, then set a flat rock at a corner. "Shed, maybe a second room later if I can get the nails." Georgia looked at the outline, then at him. "You mean for us?" His gaze met hers. "You'll need space of your own." "If you're staying." She studied his face, trying to find anything behind the calm in his eyes. "I haven't said I was." "I know." Her throat tightened. "But I haven't said I'm leaving either." He nodded, and that was the end of it. That evening, she found Gentry sitting cross-legged in the grass beside the porch, carving a stick with a small penknife Xander had given him the night before. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, fingers steady. Georgia watched him from the doorway, arms folded, the ache in her chest unfamiliar and sharp. Xander sat on the porch step, oiling a saddle strap. He didn't glance up when he spoke. "He's steadier than he was." "He slept through 3 nights, she said. "That's a first." A quiet passed between them, filled with the creak of wood and the chirp of insects waking in the dusk. "He ever talk about before?" Xander asked. Georgia stepped down onto the porch, her skirt brushing his shoulder as she passed. "Not much. Sometimes he says names in his sleep." "I don't ask, he'll speak when he's ready." Xander set the strap aside. "You carry your silence the same way." She sat beside him, not quite touching. "I was a midwife's daughter, grew up in Kansas near Abilene. My father died of fever when I was 12. My mother remarried, wrong sort of man. When she passed, I stayed, too long." Xander didn't flinch, didn't offer pity, just waited. "I took Gentry when I left," she said. "He's not mine by blood, not really, but I wasn't leaving him behind." The sky was turning lavender and the first stars blinked into view. Gentry stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and climbed into the cabin without a word. Xander leaned back against the post. "I've never had a child in the house. Quiet's different now, not worse." Georgia looked sideways at him. "You miss being alone," he gave a slow shake of his head. "I don't." She watched his hand, resting palm up on his knee, and after a moment she placed hers over it. He didn't move, but she felt the shift in his breath. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "Don't need to call it anything," he said, his voice low. "Just keep going forward." They sat like that until the moon rose full and pale. Then Georgia rose, brushed her skirts, and went inside to check the stove. Xander followed not long after, his boots silent on the worn floorboards. That night she didn't sleep on the straw mattress. She lay instead on the bed in the other room, Gentry tucked safely in the cot beside it. Xander had made no comment when she crossed the threshold. He'd simply pulled the quilt back for her and stepped aside. The fire burned low. Outside, a coyote yipped once, then fell quiet. She turned toward him beneath the covers. "You ever regret staying in one place?" He studied the ceiling. "Used to think I wasn't built for it, but I've come to see steadiness ain't the same as being stuck." She reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his jaw. Rough with stubble, warm, he caught her hand, turned his face into her palm, and kissed it. "I'm not running anymore," she said. He pulled her close, slow and certain, and wrapped his arms around her like he meant to keep her there. And she knew, in the hush between heartbeats, that she'd found something she'd never had before. Not escape, not rescue, but a place to begin, not just shelter. Not just safety, belonging. By early June, the creek near the cabin had thinned to a whisper, and the cottonwoods cast longer, steadier shadows across the pasture. The air was dry enough to split lips, and most mornings began with the rasp of wind brushing across brittle grass and the soft clatter of enamel cups on the porch rail. Georgia stood at the washbasin behind the house, wringing water from a faded linen shirt of Xander's, hanging it alongside Gentry's trousers on a length of twine. Her hair was pinned up, cheeks flushed from the sun's climb. She paused when she heard footsteps behind her boots on packed earth, familiar now. "Mail wagon came through," Xander said, holding out a folded paper. His tone was unreadable. "Something with your name." She stared at the envelope. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. "No one knows I'm here. Still found you." She wiped her hands on her apron, took it slowly. It was addressed from a small church outside Topeka. Her jaw tensed. "This is from the Reverend who helped me leave." Xander nodded once and stepped back to give her space. She opened it with steady fingers. Her eyes moved over the words, face unreadable. Then she folded it again, slipping it into her skirt pocket. "They've placed the other children from that farm, all except one." She looked up, voice low. "A girl 3 years old, no kin. They're looking for someone to take her." His brow furrowed, but he said nothing. "I can't." Georgia stopped, took a breath. "I can't help her if I'm not settled, if I don't have something solid." Xander met her eyes. "You do?" She stared at him. "You sure? You didn't ask for any of this." "I didn't," he said, "but I'd choose it now." She stepped toward him, voice quiet. "You'd taken another child. If you're here," he said, "I'll take in the whole world." She swallowed hard, then turned and walked toward the cabin. He followed. Inside, Gentry was tracing letters on the table, tongue tucked in the corner of his mouth. Georgia knelt behind him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. He leaned into her without pulling away. "I'm going to write a letter," she said. "Would you like a little sister?" His pencil paused. "She's scared like I was. Maybe. I'd share," he said after a moment. "But I don't want her to cry at night. I don't like that sound." Georgia kissed the top of his head. "We'll keep her safe." Xander stood by the doorway, his arms crossed, watching without interrupting. When Georgia rose and met his gaze, something passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but the quiet understanding of people who had decided to build something lasting. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with a strip of paper and ink. The lamp flickered, casting soft gold on her hand. Xander sat across from her, mending a pair of reins, the leather damp from oil. "What was it like?" she asked without looking up. "Before all this." He paused, thumb pressed against the worn edge of a buckle. "Dusty, loud. I moved town to town, breaking horses, hauling freight. Never stayed long enough to know the names of dogs, let alone people. And now," he looked at her, "now I know what it feels like to come home and smell bread baking, to hear a child laugh and not flinch, to wait for someone and feel it in your chest." She set the pen down carefully. "You don't say much. Never needed to." He leaned back slightly. "But I listen." She stood and walked around the table, stopped beside him. Her hand brushed the back of his neck, light as breath. "You've been listening to me all along." He looked up at her, something steady and raw in his eyes. "You're the first person who ever spoke like she meant to stay." She bent slowly, her lips brushing his. He didn't pull her closer, not yet, but the warmth in him bloomed deep, quiet, certain. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like water. Inside, the cabin held stillness, not empty, but full of breath and the heartbeat of something new in the dark. As she lay beside him later, Georgia rested her head against his chest and listened. Not for danger, not for silence, but for the sound of trust handed over without condition. And in the cradle of his arms, she felt it, the first embrace that asked for nothing and gave everything in return. By the 3rd week of June, the girl from Kansas arrived in a freight wagon driven by a mule skinner with tobacco on his breath, and no interest in the child he'd been paid to deliver. She was tiny, barefoot, with a cotton dress too thin for the wind-up in the hills, and a ribbon tied slack around her wrist like someone had tried to make her soft again. Georgia stepped forward without hesitation, lifting the girl into her arms. The child didn't cry or speak, just tucked her face against Georgia's neck and held on as if she'd been waiting for arms like that her whole life. Gentry stood behind Xander, watching. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the cabin door without being told. They named her Ruth. She slept curled in a ball for the first few nights, knees drawn high, fists clenched. Georgia took to humming while she worked the dough in the morning, low and steady, the kind of sound that didn't ask anything of the one listening. Ruth started to hum too, soft at first, then louder, until one morning she followed Georgia out to the garden without needing a hand to guide her. Xander started carving a cradle from scraps of pine. He didn't ask if it was needed. Georgia didn't ask what he was giving up to make time for it. They lived in the same rhythm, now no clock but the sun, no measure but the ones they made with their own hands. One evening, Georgia leaned against the doorframe, watching Xander scrape a whetstone along the edge of his drawknife. Ruth sat nearby, threading wildflowers into knots of yarn she'd found in a basket. Gentry was on the porch step with a book open across his lap, lips moving as he sounded out each word. "You ever think about your people?" she asked quietly. Xander didn't look up. "Sometimes, you never talk about them." Not much left to say. She stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "Did you have a father?" He set the knife down, hands still. "He worked freight lines east of Cheyenne, took off before I could remember the color of his eyes. Ma died in childbirth. I was raised by her sister, Mary, till I was old enough to hitch a team and vanish." Georgia sat beside him. "Do you ever wonder if you're anything like him?" He rubbed his palms on his trousers. "I used to. But you can only be shaped by what you run toward, not just what you run from." She looked toward the pasture where the grass had browned under the sun. "I used to think love was something you had to earn by shrinking yourself." He turned to her, brows knit. "You don't shrink here, I know," she said, voice steady, "and I don't plan to again." That night, Ruth reached for Georgia's hand in her sleep. Georgia held it without waking her. Xander watched from the doorway, arms folded across his chest, something quiet and sharp in his expression. Later, when Georgia stood to pull the curtain over the window, he touched her elbow lightly. "I was thinking," he said, voice low, "if we moved the cot into the other room, we'd have space to build a cupboard here, for her things." Georgia set her hand on his chest. "You're not just building a cupboard," he nodded once. "No, I'm not afraid to stay anymore," she whispered. He kissed her slow, steady, nothing rushed. The kind of kiss that came after long days and longer silences, after fences mended and bread risen and children settled into sleep. A kiss that asked nothing but gave everything it had. She leaned into him, fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, and rested her forehead against his. "You gave us more than shelter, Xander." He wrapped his arms around her, and this time there was nothing tentative left. "And you gave me something worth staying for." They stood in the stillness, nothing between them but the thrum of shared breath. Outside, the wind moved across the plains, bending the tall grass. Inside, the fire burned low and warm, casting long shadows across the floor where two children lay safe in the quiet. George's shawl hung on the peg by the door, worn at the edges but whole. Xander's rifle rested above the hearth, untouched. And in the hush that followed, there was no more waiting, no more wondering, only a life beginning not from nothing, but from everything they'd carried and finally laid down. The first thunder rolled low across the hills, just as Georgia finished pinning the last of Ruth's dresses to the wooden pegs Xander had carved along the wall. The summer storm had been building all afternoon, heat pressing close around the cabin until even the air inside felt heavy as wool. Xander stepped through the door with his hat in one hand and his shirt clinging to his back. Cattle are restless. They feel it coming. Georgia handed him a dry cloth. You'll stay in tonight, he nodded, wiping the sweat from his neck. I won't have them out in a storm. They'll bunch close to the trees and settle. She reached for his arm. Good. Ruth came padding in from the back room, her cheeks flushed from sleep, curls frizzed by the thick air. Georgia lifted her, resting the girl on her hip, and pressed a kiss to her temple. Let's light the lamps before it gets too dark. Xander watched as she moved about the room, Ruth's arms around her neck, one small thumb tucked into her mouth. He didn't speak until Georgia turned back and caught the look on his face. What is it? He sat down at the table, running one hand over the smooth grain. I've been thinking about the land east of here, the acre where the apple trees used to be. She sat across from him, the child still curled against her. You said the roots were too shallow for the wind. That's why they failed, but the ground's still good. He looked up, voice quiet. I could build there. Georgia's brow furrowed. Another shed. No, he reached into his pocket and set a small linen-wrapped bundle on the table. A house. Yours if you want it. She stared at the bundle, then at him. I don't need something separate. I know, he said, but I want you to have something that's yours because you chose it, not because you were given no other choice. She unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside lay a gold band, plain but warm in the lamplight, and beside it, a thinner ring shaped like a braid, the kind a man might carve himself with time and care. Georgia's throat tightened. You made this. I did. She reached across the table and took his hand. You truly mean to marry me? Xander's eyes didn't waver. I've meant it since I watched you plant that first row of beans, back all straight, jaw set like you'd already lived through the worst and still didn't break. She let out a breath, then laughed softly, tears rising but not falling. You're not a man of many words. No, he said, but I mean the ones I use. Ruth stirred in her arms and Georgia pressed her cheek to the girl's hair. Then yes. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, their hands still joined across the table. We'll have to go into town. Reverend Holden's still there. I'll sew something for the girls to wear. Gentry can carry the rings. I'll build the house with a porch, he said, his voice low and sure. Facing west so you can watch the sun go down when the day's done, she smiled against his skin. And a wide table. Big enough for 4 or more. The storm broke just after nightfall, wind lashing hard against the shutters, rain pounding the roof like hooves over dry earth. They sat by the hearth, the children asleep on the pallet nearby, and Georgia rested her head against Xander's shoulder as the fire cracked and popped. What will we be called? She asked softly. Sutton, he said without hesitation. If you'll carry it, she nodded. Georgia Sutton. Then she looked at him, a playful flicker in her eye. Sounds like a woman who doesn't run. He kissed her slow, his palm warm against her cheek, and she leaned into it fully. There was no fear in her now, only the deep, settled knowing that she had reached the end of the road she'd walked for so long alone. They married under the cottonwoods 2 weeks later, the leaves rustling above like a hymn. Ruth clung to Georgia's skirts, and Gentry stood tall beside Xander, proud in a clean shirt with the rings tied in a knot of ribbon. Georgia wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin and lace found in a traveling peddler's cart, and Xander wore his best boots, polished until the worn leather shone. The ceremony was short, simple words, steady voices. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her with both hands on her face, and Georgia laughed through the tears. Afterward, they shared bread and honey beneath the trees, the children darting between the trunks, their laughter rising like birdsong. A neighbor brought a fiddle and someone else a jug of cider, and for the first time in years, Georgia danced. She danced barefoot in the grass, the hem of her dress stained with earth, and Xander watched her with the kind of quiet joy that didn't need to be spoken. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in the new house with the fresh sawn porch and the wide table, Georgia stood beside Xander in the doorway, the sky soft with stars. You gave us roots, she whispered. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist. You gave us home. She leaned into him, her heart full, her body warm against his. And love, she said. We found that too. He kissed her under the open sky, the prairie stretched wide around them, and the wind carried the scent of grass and wood smoke. And when they went inside, hand in hand, the door closed behind them not against the world, but around something whole. Years passed. The table grew crowded with children and neighbors, laughter and stories. The land held steady, and so did the people who called it theirs. Georgia never left again. Xander never let go. And the cabin on the rise, where the porch faced west and the nights were quiet, became a place where the hardest parts of life were met with open hands, and the softest parts were held close always.